All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Daria Hamra podcast. Today, we're going to dig deep beyond the skin and beyond aesthetics, right into the brain. I'm joined by someone whose work I've admired for years, Dr. Sarah Mackay, an Oxford-trained neuroscientist, best-selling author, science communicator, and founder of the Neuroscience Academy. Sarah has this incredible ability to take the complex science of the brain and turn it into real-life digestible insight. So as someone who works with people every day who want to look the way they feel, this episode hits home for me. We'll talk about everything from neuroplasticity to baby brain to why teens think that parents are the worst. And as a parent of two teenagers, I'm really interested in that part. And yes, even body dysmorphia and in the age of social media. So let's dive right in. Sarah, first of all, welcome to the show and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you're doing a podcast tour, you're going on a bunch of gigs this year. And first of all, tell me, how do you find time to do all of this? I'm already struggling, as is. You're writing multiple books. You're almost on every podcast that I see. You're actively involved in the field, and you're a mother to two children that are teenagers. How do you do all of that? Just give us is there a hack? Is there a tool? Is there an app for it? How do you do it?
If my husband heard you ask this question, he would laugh his head off. It's smoke and mirrors. It really is.
Okay.
I wrote my books last year. So this year, what I'm very, very busy doing is not a lot. I'm just trying to ride the wave of having done a lot of work over the last few years. And this year I am just, as I say, I'm sort of taking a sabbatical, and that I'm not trying not to write. I'm trying not to create. I'm just trying to...
Me time.
Not necessarily me time. Not continually be on the hamster wheel of creating and writing and striving, which I've done for about 50 years. Just having a bit of time out. So this year has been very, very chill and very relaxed, actually. It just looks like I'm busy because I'm going on a lot of podcasts. My boys are teenagers now, so they're in their final year. My oldest son's got just a few weeks left of high school, and my other son's got 2.5 years left. So, they're pretty self-sufficient now. I work for myself.
So are you?
It probably looks like I'm busier than I am. Let's be honest. My husband brings me a cup of coffee in bed every morning, and that is one of the greatest little pleasures of my life. And that's why I'm thinking he would laugh if he heard you ask me how I do it all, because he does a lot. I married well. He's a legend, and I think that's probably part of it. Plus, I try not to take too many things too seriously. I just try. And I turned 50 at the beginning of the year. I've got friends who never made it this far.
Happy birthday. Welcome to the club.
Yeah, I'm just trying to have a good time. And
Is it safe to say... It
looks busier than I am, honestly.
From what I can hear, it sounds like you're living a dream. Is that true? Is that safe to say?
Oh, sure. I don't know whether
Do you have any regrets? I know we're getting deep.
Regrets about life. Regrets about life, or regrets about taking a year to just hang out. I have no regrets.
It's too early to judge the year of taking off. Yeah, it's too early to judge that.
No, zero regrets. I've had the best year ever. Do I have any regrets? No, I don't think so. Sometimes I feel like there's sliding door moments when you look back on your life, where you could have, life could have taken on a completely different trajectory, but for a moment. But I suppose part of what we do is we create an identity by telling ourselves stories about how we ended up where we are. And I'm quite an optimistic, upbeat person. So I feel like perhaps if there are regrets, I've told myself, or I've woven a narrative around that story and either turned it into a joke or turned it into a story about how I got to where I am. So No regrets. Perhaps the I had have been a little kinder to myself when my boys were little, because that was a really hard grind. But I didn't know then what I know now. So,
Well, I think we all did that. I mean, that's just no one took us through motherhood or fatherhood school. I mean, I think that's part of life. But were you a person that got out of her comfort zone very easily without overthinking things? Or were you someone that was more looking towards safety, security, and just like to keep things within the walls of, I guess, comfort?
I never felt unsafe. I've had an incredibly fortunate, upbringing in childhood with a lot of love and safety and security. So I never felt like I had to seek that. I just had always had the assumption, and perhaps always do, that the world is safe and secure. And I never felt like I was trying to, like, if I look back to like my teenage years and early 20s, I was very ambitious in that I wanted to do as well as I possibly could. It wasn't necessarily in competition with other people. And I grew up, like, my mum and dad left school when they were both 15, and I'd never met anyone who went to university in my life until I went to university, except my family doctor and my dentist, who happened to be married to each other. And me and my best friend, who's a neuropsychiatrist, we joke when we were growing up. One of our friends' dads was an engineer, so we also knew him, who'd gone to university. So I never felt like I was out of my comfort zone, because I hadn't really quite a naive view of the world, but I knew what I liked to do, which was study and learn, and I really enjoyed that. So that was really what drove me. It wasn't about feeling safe or uncomfortable. It was just about doing what I enjoyed doing, which I still do now. And I guess part of that's coming from a very happy childhood, but perhaps without so my parents were not ambitious, but parents whose focus was on me and my sister, not on the world around us. And I guess that's probably shaped a little bit of who I am now still. And that I just quite like neuroscience still. And and I always say that my career, I suppose, has been about like reading neuroscience papers and doing a bit of research and then finding what's interesting and then telling other people about it. It's not very complicated.
and you're doing an amazing job to use something that's so scientific and abstract and explaining it in a way, communicating it in a way that the layman easily understands and can apply. So you have this just innate ability, and that not many have it, especially scientists, of a concept that is very abstract. Now, how did you even get into neuroscience? And also, if you can explain to our listeners, what is neuroscience actually? And how did you get into it? Because you got into it in a time where I don't think, we're exactly the same generation. To be honest, when I went to university, I didn't even know about neuroscience. I knew about neurology, but I didn't know about neuroscience per se. And now it's actually a very popular field in medicine and science.
Well, thanks, first of all, for the compliments on how good I am at explaining this, but I wouldn't argue it's not innate. It's, 30 years of a career, you learn a little bit along the way about and having a lot of conversations with people about neuroscience, particularly the last 10 or so years that I've been teaching neuroscience. I've learned from my students how to talk about the science with them. So that's an iterative learning process on my part, not something that's just in me. In terms of how I got into neuroscience, well, I always have the book next to me when I do a podcast because people often ask me about it. And you'd probably be familiar with this book from our generation.
Of course.
Yeah, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks.
Yes, I actually read it in German. I went to school in Germany. I was born and raised in Germany, and I remember that.
There you go.
Yes.
1993, Psych 101, Canterbury University, New Zealand. That's in the town of Christchurch where I grew up. And we were told to read this book, and I switched universities the following year because Otago University, Dunedin, New Zealand, had just put together a new degree discipline in neuroscience. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who went on to do dentistry down there, and I said, oh, wow, I was thinking of, I really love this biology of psychology idea. And I remember talking about it with him in my first year at Canterbury. And he said, oh, well, Otago's putting together a degree in neuroscience. I think they'd formed it that year. So I switched universities, and I also really wanted to go to that university because it had a really great student vibe. And I've always wanted to just go away to college, live in halls, have that student life. So it was a good excuse, really. So I headed down there, and then was in that first cohort to graduate with a degree in neuroscience. And I'm still in touch with some of the people from that year. One of my closest friends did a postdoc in the US and then went to work for PubMed for many, many years. Sadly, just got replaced by AI, which apparently is not doing as good a job as the actual brains than the humans indexing the journal articles. But that was really, it was reading that book. And for those who don't know, Oliver Sacks was a neurologist who writes these amazing case studies. He's a fantastic writer and communicator as well as a neurologist who wrote up the unusual case studies of the things that go wrong with how people think and feel and behave when something goes wrong with their brain. And I was just captivated, and I'm still captivated today. And then I just carried on. Was very fortunate, and I went off overseas as all Kiwi and Aussie kids did back then. They still do now. After my university degree in New Zealand, we called it our OE. Do you know what the big OE is?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, the big overseas experience.
Yes.
I don't know whether they still use that language now in New Zealand. Haven't lived there for a long time, but
they use it in England.
You go on your big OE.
Yep.
Or they call it a gap year sometimes if you go after high school.
So
sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I went traveling, and when I was overseas traveling, then I was going and reading. I was actually living in Edinburgh working in a pub, and I was picking up the nature, back in the days when nature and science, they would actually come in the magazine form, which I still do prefer. Yeah. And I was reading the classifieds in the back looking for PhD opportunities, and I saw that the Wellcome Trust was funding 4-year studentships to do a master's and a PhD, and they were offering them at Cambridge, UCL in London and Oxford. So I went and interviewed in all of them. Actually, I ended up with the Oxford spot and didn't go and interview for the Cambridge one because I thought, oh God, Oxford seems like quite a good choice.
You don't want to do that. You don't want to ruffle any feathers.
Well, it was pretty, and coming from like this little Kiwi kid who grew up in the eastern suburbs of Christchurch with parents who had never been to university, it was pretty wild to end up in Oxford.
Yeah, you made a huge leap.
Yeah, it was
not just
cool.
to any university.
But again, because I didn't have imposter syndrome, wasn't invented then. I just landed there and thought, well, this is pretty cool. I'm going to meet some new people, drink some beers, party a bit, do a bit of neuroscience.
Whatever.
I loved my time there. It was really fun, and I met my Irish husband who was studying economics, and then we moved to Sydney and carried on.
What made you move to Sydney?
I got to the end of my PhD. My husband was working in London in financial services as an economist, and we thought, well, where else in the world should we live? He's, Irish and Kiwis travel, and then we wrote down a list of really cool cities in the world we'd like to live in, and Sydney was on that list. And then he made some inquiries with someone that he knew who worked in the company he was with, and they said, oh, for sure, we've actually got a position here now. How soon can you move? And we were like, oh, let's go to Sydney. We'll go. And he told his Irish mother, we'll go to Sydney for a year. And that was in 2002. And then we came here and we were like, Sydney, Australia, the Northern Beaches where we live is perhaps one of the better places in the world to live. We're very fortunate. They let us in, and it's our home. And now
I have a cousin actually that lives in Sydney. So, so I haven't ever been there to the island, but it's on my bucket list. It's been,
pretty cool.
I just have to find the time, but I'm not, how did he get adapted and acclimated to the sun down there, your husband, coming from Ireland?
Lots of sunscreen.
Yeah.
Annual skin cancer checks. And I grew up, I'll probably be worse off than him because I grew up in New Zealand, and we didn't really start wearing sunscreen until maybe I was about 10, 11, 12. I grew up,
I think at our
with my
age,
skin
sunscreen wasn't
peeling.
invented yet. I think it wasn't
No,
invented.
they started a skin cancer campaign called Slip Slop Slap, which everyone from my age would. I'm not going to sing because I cannot
What year
sing.
was that? Do you
I
remember?
can't remember. It was late childhood, early teenage years, perhaps. Slip Slop Slap, which was slip on a shirt, slop on sunscreen, slap on a hat, and then they added slide on some sunglasses to try and bring the skin cancer rates down. But I have an annual skin cancer check now, just to
Yes.
keep on. And I've had a few like little things burned off, but nothing major. Most people I know have.
To that point, I think people associate still. I think sunscreen is somewhat of a. It's not a misnomer, but it implies only half the truth because people are associated. At least I'm trying to re-educate my patients that sunscreen is not just to prevent sunburn, is also to prevent aging of the skin. At the same time, the sun is so important for us, for our cells, because it has very valuable infrared component, the invisible part of the light that is so important for our mitochondria, for our cellular function, our brains, and our mood has so many benefits that finding a middle is just so hard educating the patients.
People don't seem to like to find a middle these days, do they? And I think growing up in Australia, we have a very different attitude towards that because every single person has the experience of if you don't wear sunscreen and you're outside, you get severely, well, no, it's not skin cancer, you get severely burned very, very easily. So there's not really an either or about whether you should be wearing sunscreen because you absolutely have to. Everyone knows what happens if you don't. The balance then is that does not mean that then you stay inside and never go in the sun. Sure. It's how to spend time outdoors safely, wear sunscreen, wear the protection, don't avoid the sun. And most Aussies don't. I mean, we're pretty outdoorsy, sporty people. Kiwis too. I kind of consider myself a bit of both now. So, but the conversations now are, of course, as we know, you're frothing at either side. It's either black or white, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And the sunscreen argument seems quite ridiculous to people living in this part of the world.
Yeah, very true. So let's change gears here a little bit.
Yeah.
And, I wanted to get an idea for the audience to understand what the word neuroplasticity means, because a lot of what we're going to be discussing kind of will refer back to that. So getting some definitions set for the audience so that we're talking about the same things and they kind of understand it. So let's start with the basics. What does neuroplasticity actually mean? And how can understanding this help people who are trying to reinvent themselves or change for the better, break out of their shell and do something different, whether it is through health, therapy, or whatever that might be, lifestyle change. Can you explain neuroplasticity in that context for our audience?
Well, I mean, I kind of see them as somewhat different conversations, sort of behavioural change. But I'll talk about neuroplasticity first because I think it's very easy to conflate the two and think because one happens, the other automatically will. And neuroplasticity is simply an umbrella term to describe the many various mechanisms and ways by which the brain changes. And it does that while it's learning and also during development. So there's a lot of different ways a brain can change. And a brain can learn and a brain can grow and a brain can be altered by experience. And under that sort of umbrella is, I mean, if you kind of think about a brain changing, what do we mean by that? We can zoom all of the way in, which is what I kind of like to do. We've got to zoom all of the way in and take a look at individual neurons and connections between neurons that we call synapses and how they might change in terms of structure and function in response to some experience that the organism or the human is having. And we know quite a lot and a great deal of detail about how connections between neurons change in response to experiences. And a lot of this underlies what we might call learning. So remembering what you did earlier in the day, or if you pick up a book at night, you can remember, what was happening as you were reading that book. So your brain has retained that information, and to retain that information, it has in some way had to have changed, whether it's changed structurally at the levels of individual neurons, or whether somehow the firing rate or the ways or the means by which those neurons have communicated have changed. So we can kind of zoom in and look at it, and that way we can zoom out a little bit more and look at how the structures of whole neurons or perhaps neural pathways change. So we might see during very early in utero and childhood development, we see the explosion in numbers of new neurons. You're getting neurogenesis happening. So new neurons are being born. And we could put that under the guise of plasticity. How much neurogenesis is happening in an adult human brain after adolescence is debatable, but it's probably pretty minimal. And if it does happen, it's only happening in very specific parts of the brain, most likely the hippocampus, which is involved with learning and memory. But whether or not those new neurons are part of the learning process in an adult human is debatable, because we know that most learning happens at the level of the synapse. We could look at a more kind of gross, or not microscopic level, but say you were to put someone's brain in a brain scanner and image it. We could look to see, does the structure of a whole brain change? Do areas of cortex get thinner or thicker as you acquire a new skill? Do we see subcortical nuclei, so deep below the cortex, do we see changes in the structure of whole
do we
nuclei? In human brains, it's pretty minimal. We couldn't pop a brain in a brain scanner and say, hey, you've learned a new habit, therefore your striatum is bigger. We don't often see, and we can talk about pregnancy and adolescence, because that's a little bit different. We do see large structural change. And that's why it's hard to talk about plasticity, because there's so many things that can change. And then we could also
it's a broad term.
We could put a brain in a brain scanner and a functional MRI or some type of brain imaging that looks at patterns of activity and how networks interact and communicate. And we could see these networks shift in response to experiences we have, whether they be hormonal shifts in our body or perhaps learning something new, as you're learning to master a new skill, like how to shoot a hoop or something in basketball. So we could see how networks shift and alter in response to experiences. So under this big word neuroplasticity, which is almost kind of taken on quite like kind of a mythical kind of meaning, there's many, many, many levels of organization in the brain, from changes in currents across a membrane to changes in brain structure. Does that mean, then the next kind of thing is, which was the second part of your question, what does that mean in terms of behavior change and in terms of, you said therapy as well, which is perhaps something different because you might be trying to address a problem. And I would see that as, we might take a different approach to just teaching a kid how to learn to read, or a child learning to walk, or perhaps learning to regulate emotions, or perhaps learning a new habit. It's probably easier just to think about learning a new skill. What do we see happening in a brain when you're learning a new behavior or learning a new skill? And we see changes all the way from the level of, the kind of the currents within an individual neuron, the firing rates of individual neurons, synapses, all the way out to maybe broad scale changes in how networks interact. And we can see that play out, but simply because we can see it happen when it does happen doesn't mean it's easy to change. There was a meta-analysis that came out, I believe, what year are we in now? I don't know, because I'm getting my years
25.
confused, whether it was 2023 or 2024. It was this broad scale meta-analysis that looked at behavior change across both individual health behaviors, where people were trying to improve health, or more on a kind of a sort of a public societal level, and they looked at things like, say, vaccination campaigns or trying to get people to change habits for environmental reasons. And if we just look at the individual behavior change for health, because I think that's kind of most meaningful for us, it was looking at, can we tap into mindset? Can we look at motivation? Can we look at teaching people new skills? And it kind of ranked almost the different ways we can look at behavior change. And it found the most powerful way to help someone change was to look at habits. And this is both habits that someone may have formed that are preventing them from behaving in a new way, or teaching someone a new skill or behavior that then eventually becomes habitual. And habits are a really kind of fun way to think about brain plasticity, because habits come about via you performing a particular behavior over and over and over and over again. It's very similar to motor learning, like learning to ride a bike or learning to shoot a hoop or any kind of motor skill. Performing a particular behavior enough times that your brain kind of goes, and this is what brains consciously think, but this is a sort of a loose metaphor. The brain goes, well, that skill is so important. I am going to move it down into a region of the brain called the striatum, where I store my automated motor skills and behaviors, so that that behavior just rolls out in response to a cue or a situation, because I want to free up cortex. I want to free that up for learning something new or reacting or responding to change in my environment. I don't want to be consciously thinking about performing that behavior. And so if we think about learning to ride a bike, you learned, whatever age you learned to ride, 6, 7, 8, you had to figure it out and learn how to ride, and you would show and how, and you balanced and you wobbled, and it probably took all of your learning and thinking and motivation and emotion regulation, and then eventually you learned how to do it. But you don't need to be motivated to remember how to balance on a bike. You don't need to work through that kind of the steps or the strategies to remember how to ride a bike. You just know how to ride a bike. It's become, stored as an automated behavior. And habit formation is very similar. So whether you brush your teeth every morning, you don't usually nowadays, most of us, you would hope, don't have to go, right, I'm going to brush my teeth today. I've just got to work up the motivation to do that, right? And then when I do it, I have to remember the steps of how to do it. In fact, I say to people, not only is the act of brushing your teeth what we would habitual, so probably too is the motor movement, the way you move your brush around your mouth. So next time you brush your teeth, think about the way you're moving your brush around your teeth. Like what way are you doing that? Have you got I bet you probably do it the same every time.
Yeah.
And that's great because that frees your mind up to think about something else. You have a system
in place. But to me, the hard part is not creating a habit, is to initiate a habit, to start, because you have to start
something new.
Once you start it becomes much easier. So I try to re-educate a lot my patients on also health and wellness, where I have to re-educating them about changing their lifestyle, whether it be exercising more, eating more mindfully, picking their diet as opposed to just eating what's in front of them. So those are habits that they have to create, but initiate that change. And back to what you started saying does it get more difficult to learn a new habit or start a new habit the older we get? We say always, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Is that true, or is that some sort of myth within that context?
That's a very interesting question. I think it's always easier to learn when you've got a younger brain, which is more plastic, but it is probably domain specific. So it probably depends.
And what does that mean exactly?
That means, so if we think about learning to ride a bike when you're 5 years old,
sure,
motor, you're still in the process of learning motor skills and refining those parts of the brain which would be involved with, and by motor I mean movement, the control of your muscles. Yep. Compared to learning to ride a bike for the very first time when you're 65, it's probably going to be a whole lot harder. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by domain specific. I think the key to changing habits is to understand are you performing a behavior that you no longer want to perform? Or are you trying to learn a new behavior? And that all comes down to, if there's a behavior that you're performing that you no longer want to, that could be part of your health. Say, what's an unhealthy habit someone might have? Like maybe they have like a
eating
massive
junk food,
like a massive bowl of ice cream after dinner every night. So what's the cue for that?
Or late night meals. Mm-hmm.
Or late night meals. There's always a cue or a trigger or a situation which means that behavior rolls out. And so you've got to identify, when it comes to behavior change, are you performing a behavior you no longer want to? And therefore, what is the cue or the situation that causes that behavior to just roll out without thought or motivation or much emotion, whatever? And then can you change that cue or situation? Can you, if it's a particular person that you see that always causes a particular thought pattern to roll out, can you avoid that person? Perhaps you can't avoid that person.
Like triggers you for some reason. Yeah.
It can't eliminate that person from your life. Can you remove the cue? Because if you remove the cue or the situation, then there's nothing prompting the habit. If you cannot remove the cue or the situation, like you can't move house, move job, moving house is a really great time to implement new habits and behaviors. And this has been quite well studied. Because you're changing all of the context and the situation you're in. When you move to a new house, the first evening you're in your new house and it starts to get dark, you don't know where the light switches even are to go and turn on the lights, right? As you've lived in that house for a few years, when it starts to get dark, you're not having to think about where the light switches are to turn the lights on, right? So context is incredibly important, and it's a great time to implement new behaviors is when you move house, because you've changed context. So you've got to figure out, is the behavior I'm doing one I don't want to do? Or is there a new behavior I want to implement, but say I can sort of stack it on something else I already do? So my husband recently, he's always got to, putting his back out every now and then. And that's where he kind of stores his stress. He went and saw the physio, and the physio is like, well, I need you every day. I need you to be doing leg swings and I need you to be doing squats. And so then the physio is like, and this is classic behavior change sort of strategy, do you make coffee every morning? My husband's like, yeah, he's got his fancy coffee machine. And the physio said, okay, well, will you turn your machine on? And then when you stand there, do your squats, do your leg swings.
That's
so you're
actually
stacking
what
a
I
habit.
do.
Yeah, you're stacking a habit onto something because you're always going to have your coffee, right? Because coffee is a habit, but there's also caffeine in there, which is addictive. Although coffee is probably one of the few substances we can become addicted to and doesn't, if you don't drink too much, it's actually quite good for you.
It's a lot of studies on there.
We just think
I love my coffee. Up to 3 cups, you're good.
I get so excited when I go to bed at night. I'm one of those people.
Me too.
Oh, cool. I can't wait to go to bed because I get to have my coffee. And then I sit up in bed and my husband brings me the coffee that he's made after he's done his squats. And so to change a behavior, can we stack onto a behavior we are already doing? And then and so you've got a prompt, and then
great advice.
But then you've got to then roll that behavior out. And then that's what's hard is doing the behavior enough times so it feels good and it feels rewarding that your brain's going to go, okay, I'm just going to do this automatically. It's
so that way it turns into a habit.
But that's not always necessarily, that's easier than said than done. It depends on how rewarding and engaging that behavior is. So a great example here, we can talk about teenagers, right?
Yes.
So how many times would you have to tell a teenager to clean and tidy their room and put their clothes in the washing basket to be washed for them to automatically do that without being asked?
You just set off a trigger in me. Yeah.
Like weekly for 5 years, they probably still won't do it, right? Because it's perhaps not very fun or rewarding or exciting for that behavior for them to become a habit. But how long did it take them? You gave them one of these things, and how long did it take that for their behavior to become habitual? Because this is like way more engaging, and you get so much reward from that behavior. It becomes a habit to use it very, very, very quickly compared to cleaning and tidying their room. So there's no set number of particular repeats for that behavior to become habitual. It's all mixed up with how engaging and rewarding and fun that behavior is for you to repeat.
Well, I think it goes back to dopamine, right? maybe you can tell us a little bit what dopamine does to our brain, because you pointed out this thing here, and for the listeners, we're holding up our cell phones and talking about teenagers, and talk to us a little bit about how the reward system in the brain works and why basically the principle of what you just said.
So dopamine is, I like to think of it as a learning molecule. Essentially what it does, and all our brains are doing, like let's just take a step back from dopamine. Sure. All our brains are doing, and interesting, I think our immune system is quite similar to our nervous system, is it is learning by experience. It's experiencing all of the stuff that's happening in our body and the world around us and making meaning of it and going, that was useful. I'm going to do it again next time. Or, that sucked. I'm not going to do that. And part of that process of learning and understanding what was great, so I will do it again, and what sucked, I'm not going to do that ever again, is that process of learning. And one of the neuromodulators, which is as the molecule dopamine, which is released at synapses. There's not actually that many dopaminergic neurons in the brain. There's quite a limited number, but we've got neurotransmitters in our brain, and there's the two main ones are glutamate and GABA, and they actually do all of the heavy lifting and all of the work and most of the synapse communication. And then we have neuromodulators, which are far more famous, and I always feel sorry for glutamate and GABA because they do the work. But neuromodulators, the neurons that make them, they're far fewer in number, but they have a kind of a broader kind of effect, and that it's almost, I think of them as like an old-fashioned radio, like what we grew up with. And, you had your treble and your bass, and you could dial up and dial down. I don't know what you do now. You just press play on Spotify or whatever. Yeah. And neuromodulators almost kind of allow you to dial in or dial out, or they amplify or minimize the signaling of glutamate and GABA. And one of the roles of dopamine as a neuromodulator, when you have an experience, is you go, oh, well, that was really cool. I enjoyed picking up that phone. And so you've got dopamine kind of, it's neurons with dopamine are tonically active, which means they're not on or off. They're always kind of firing away. And when something happens that you really enjoy, it goes, loads of dopamine is kind of released. And that's a learning cue. And so your brain goes, that experience was quite good. And that means next time, in anticipation of that experience, before it even happens, dopamine is released to remind you that was quite good. And that kind of drives you forwards to want to do that again. You don't get the reward once you've done that behavior a few times. The dopamine is released almost in anticipation of that. So it's like the coffee, we're going, I'm looking forward to having the coffee. It's not necessarily the drinking of the coffee, it's the anticipation. It's the dopamine. But dopamine, because it's tonically active, and this is really important, it's like, a guy beating a drum, or a drummist, a drummer. Could be great a girl analogy. As well. Yeah. A drummer, there's always and that's really great because it means it can go faster, but it can also go slower. And dopamine, when you experience something that you really do not like, or it's a bit of a letdown, dopamine kind of signals a bit of like disappointment, or that sort of sucked. And that means next time you think about that experience or in anticipation of that experience, you're like, you're almost kind of, instead of moving towards, you're kind of moving back and not wanting to engage in that again, because dopamine has also signaled disappointment. It's not just reward, it's actually learning. It's like, what worked? I'm doing it again. What sucked? I'm not going to try that again. And that is a very interesting thing to think about, particularly if, say, you've got kids who have really negative experiences, say, in education. My 15-year-old son, is studying Macbeth at the moment, and he's got an essay on Shakespeare due. And there's perhaps not many 15-year-olds who are like loving writing their comparative essay on Macbeth and the pursuit of happiness.
Those were my nightmare in high school. Oh my God.
Everyone has been through, and then and my oldest son, who is very academic, but he likes to think he's quite Sigma. He's quite a cool guy, actually, has decided he likes Shakespeare, I think, just to wind his younger brother up, but as being an amazing coach on trying to coach his younger brother through this essay writing. And then the four of us were in the car this morning driving to, I dropped my boys off at school and my son, my husband off at the ferry, which when the four of us are hardly ever in the car anymore. You've got teenagers, that doesn't happen.
I know.
And then I was like, isn't it great the four of us are in the car? And my husband says, what can we talk about? Let's come up with a topic. And my oldest son says, let's talk about Macbeth. And of course, he just did that to piss his younger brother off.
Jokingly, yeah.
No, he's like, let's talk. And me and my husband are, let's talk about Shakespeare. And my younger son's going, I hate Shakespeare. And that's because he's had these experiences of Shakespeare, which is hard. It's hard to get your mind, or you can't kind of get through it. And very few kids, I think, get to the other side where they go, actually, that was they like the grind, they like the learning curve.
See, I feel it's too early because in English we had to read Macbeth, and that was in Germany. Actually, here in the States, they canceled it because they said it's sexist or racist. I don't know what. It's crazy.
You can look at it within, but I think it's you look at it within the context.
Yeah,
right?
But this is the woke society in the US that shifted the pendulum towards the other side. But in Germany, I had to read Macbeth in English, which was our foreign language.
The double challenge.
It was a double challenge. I hated it because I just didn't understand it. I was 15. Yeah. I was chasing girls. I just didn't understand why my brain wasn't even wired.
You still sound you sound exactly like my son. And this is the thing.
It was torture.
And it is torture. And because there's no
But why is it part of the curriculum?
Because I think it's very good to understand.
Yeah, in college.
College? No, I disagree, because in Australia you don't go in and do everything in your first year of university. I think it is really good to be intellectually challenged and to be.
I guess, you're right.
They were not going to go down that path in Germany, because the German academic curriculum is so intellectual and intellectually rigorous.
Yes.
And I think we need to challenge kids. We perhaps just need to teach it in new and different ways. And if you've got a great teacher and you get all the way through that process, and you understand the themes, you learn about the language, you learn about the figures of speech, and you can see how those themes are still current today. But that process of getting there doesn't feel like a lot of fun. And so the brain is going, that sucked, I don't want to do it again. That really sucked, I really don't want to do it again. So there's no motivation to want to repeat the behaviour. So you're moving away from that. And essentially, so we've just used Macbeth here and Shakespeare and you're still a little bit troubled by your experience. Whereas I loved Macbeth. I thought it was awesome. I love that play. It's my favourite. But that's what the brain is doing. All it's doing is learning.
It's interesting. I want you to kind of tell us a little bit about the difference between a male and female brain, because I remember all the girls in my class around that age, like first or second year of high school, when we were doing Macbeth, and also in German literature, where we're doing the German literature, all the girls were hyper engaged. Like, they were the ones that raising their arms. They had usually the better grades. And for us, at least for me, and other than one or two boys, it was just much harder. We weren't that interested. Is it because the maybe teenage female brain develops a little faster, matures faster, and so because they had a better understanding, they would comprehend things better, they got more engaged, and we were just not mature enough yet, even though we're the same age? How does that differ between the two genders at that age?
So there's kind of two questions there, just like the male versus female brain and then the teenage brain. So I'll come back to talking about broad scale sex differences in the brain, but I will just say, yes, brains go through puberty too. But what we see, and there's a bit of it's like girls are more mature than boys, and part of what we would see in classroom behaviour is partly that, but it's also that's the kind of the social expectation, whereas girls have been socialised and are, happier to kind of sit in class and engage and put their hands up, whereas boys are a little bit slower to do that. And I see and I've told this story a number of times as well, when I go to my son's high school prize giving every year, they're in high school for sort of 6 years. We don't have middle school here. So from sort of 12 through to 17, and the girls are getting like the first prize first in class prizes. Probably
Always, yeah.
70% are girls, sort of years 7, 8, grades 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then we start to see the switch. And in that final year, it's the boys are topping that. And is
But
that
is that a
maturity?
maturation, Shane?
Is that
I think
maturity? Is that testosterone? Is that social?
because that was exactly my story.
Yeah, and you see that, and I think that there's so many pieces to that. Like, firstly, I will say we see brain maturation and during puberty and adolescence tracks alongside pubertal stage versus chronological age.
Makes sense.
So we see you could have an early maturing boy with a more mature stage of brain development than a late maturing girl. So again, we've got standard distribution curves of everything, including pubertal development. So on average, a group of 1,000 girls would go through puberty about a year or so before a group of 1,000 boys, but you'll have kids at either kind of end of that. So perhaps that's part of it. Girls have also been socialized from a very, very young age to kind of behave in ways that are a little bit more appropriate to the classroom, and that starts quite young, but we do see these different trajectories in terms of, say, maths achievement and childhood with girls is slightly less than boys, and is that to do, how much of that is socialized versus biological?
Yes, and I have a question on that if we can come back to that too.
Yeah, so we've got a
couple of things.
Can you put the pins in these things?
Yes, I will. I've put the pins.
I'm looking around for a pen to write notes to remind myself to cover these off.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I suppose we've got that maturation aspect. We've got the social kind of environment that kids are in and how girls are socializing in adolescence and how boys are socializing in adolescence. And we know once testosterone enters the picture, there's that kind of social hierarchy and jostling for position that boys and males across all species do. And we see that across all cultures. There's that, and it's not necessary, and it's much more good-natured. Whereas girls aren't socialized and perhaps have a less of a biological drive to be as hierarchical as boys are.
Is that an evolutionary biology thing from an evolutionary biology?
I don't know enough about it, and this is just my observation. But my oldest son said to me, I said, oh, well, what's happening with the girls? He said, oh, well, the girls who used to be first in class in years 7 and 8 aren't now, and all the boys are kind of working their way up. And he said, oh, the girls are too busy fighting with each other. They're becoming more socially complex and they're not wanting to compete with each other, whereas the boys are happy to compete and happy to compete for rankings in ways that the girls aren't necessarily. And so that's like a combination there. It's hard to say, is that all biological? How much is testosterone? How much is socialized? It's always going to be a complex mix of the two. And often what we see is boys just muck about for a lot of high school, and then right at the end of high school, in Australia at least, when it really counts, then they kind of lock in and then they study to get the grade to get into the university course. So how much of that is nature? How much is nurture? Is it Mother Nature? Is it the patriarchy? It's going to be a combination, as everything to do with the brain and behavior is.
Well, I mean, if you go back millions of years and you see how even in the animal kingdom, how males and females behave. I mean, of course, a lot of our behaviors have to do with hormones, the social ranking and status, even in the animal kingdom. And I think from an evolutionary biology standpoint is how things evolved, when the female or in the animal kingdom or the women in humans, when they bear a child, their entire focus is on protecting the child and raising the child. And so they're all the biochemistry in their brain is basically from an evolutionary standpoint, just geared to focus on the child, to protect 100%. The child and raise the child. And back in the days when we were cavemen, I'm sure there were a bunch of women with a bunch of children, protecting them, feeding them, raising them, just like in the animal kingdom. And then even though with the lions, it's the females that go hunting. But then the males would go and, hunt or protect the tribe and then come back with food. How much of that do you think has to do with how the neurochemistry or our brains have evolved? Because we're talking about millions of years. We're not just talking about the patriarchy, or we're not talking about the
I always
past.
say, is it Mother Nature or the patriarchy? I think there are, across cultures and across species, sex-based differences in terms of behavior, particularly when it comes to child rearing, because of course mothers get pregnant and bear the young, and then in mammals we feed our young. But some mammals are not alloparents like humans are, whereby we raise our children at groups. You've got a cat who has kittens in the wild. She needs to go and hunt and gather food to bring that back for her own kittens. She's not got someone else doing that for her. So we've got, when you go through your pregnancy and then have your babies, there are very species-specific behaviors which emerge as part of the maternal brain, which determine which behaviors you need to do to keep your babies alive. A dolphin's behavior is going to be very different from a herding animal's behavior, from a hunting and gathering animal's, from a predator's behavior.
Of course.
Typically, whatever that mother needs to do to keep her babies safe and alive, she's going to get better at. And then that means her attention will be less focused on other types of behaviors. True. I just want to get back to, before we talk about the maternal brain, the sex differences question, because that's really I used to not like talking about it, but now I'm really happy to talk about it, because I feel like the data has emerged to kind of give us insight into answering some of these questions, because we've got more data now, so we can say with more certainty various things. But also, I've been thinking a lot about the brain for many years now. And when we look at a brain, there's so many different things that we could measure about that brain. If we were to look at a difference between a male brain and a female brain, what we really should be doing is looking at like 1,000 male brains and 1,000 female brains. And we are able to do that now with biobanks and data sharing, etc. But if you're to get a metric of a brain compare to another brain, there's 1,000 different things you could measure. You could look at the overall size and shape of a brain. You could look at various subcortical nuclei and look at their size and shape. You could look at counting neurons. You could look at receptors. You could look at neurotransmitters. You could look at what does a brain look like in a scanner in response to a particular stimulus? What do the networks look like? How do they change across puberty, across other reproductive life, experiences in females? You could look at susceptibility to disease, to mental health risk. You could look at particular types of behaviors. You could do a battery of cognitive tests. You could do 15 different types of cognitive tests. Yep. And so you've got thousands of different metrics. And some of those measures, if we looked across male and female populations, you would see sex-based differences. And some of those metrics, you'll see no differences whatsoever. So sometimes people talk about a mosaic, and that you'll see some differences in some metrics and not in others. And when we do see a sex-based difference, typically, if we look across populations, as overlapping standard deviation curves. You've not got blue and pink, blue brains over here and pink brains over here. You're looking at quite subtle statistical differences. Mm. And if you do see these statistical differences, the question then is, what contributes to that? Is that 100% biology? Is that all down to XY, XX chromosomes, testosterone in males, sex, hormones in females, or is it down to perhaps something a little bit more like, reproductive life experiences in the female, or is it completely socialized? Does it all come down to sort of experiences you have by virtue of growing up male and female? And there's a couple of fascinating studies that have come out in the last couple of years, some of them within the US looking at between states, and some of them globally looking between countries. So one of the studies was in the journal PNAS 2023-ish, I believe it came out, and they were looking at brain structural differences between males and females in different countries in the world. So it was MRI, looking at the structure of the brain, and people in early midlife, so like late 20s, early 30s, so past, adolescence, early adulthood.
So basically a mature brain.
Yeah, an early mature brain, and looking to see, based on the gender equality within that country, so equality of education, equality of employment, equality of environmentally enriched experiences, and they ranked all of those countries. And so countries like, say, the Nordic Scandinavian countries, very high gender equality. And this study, I believe Turkey, Brazil, and I'm not sure what other countries ranked. Turkey and Brazil ranked quite low, and India ranked quite low in gender equality. And the differences between the male and female brains were greater when there was greater gender inequality, and were more similar when there was gender equality. The male brains were pretty similar everywhere in the world. It was the female brains in countries with more gender inequality that were kind of deviated.
And then what does that mean? Is that like, are we interpreting it in a good way or bad way or neutral?
Well, I don't think it's good or bad. What it's saying is that it's not just biological sex, which is contributing to the differences that we always see when we see a difference between a group of males and a group of females. It's always going to be a combination of both. So here we're seeing gender inequality made the differences greater because there was less enriched, we would call it an enriched environmental opportunity for girls in education and then in employment, and then perhaps the stress of gender inequality in those parts of the world. And similar studies have been done looking at and that's looking at brain structure. So in the last year or two, studies have been done within the US looking at equality of opportunity within different states in the US, looking at people in their 80s and 90s. And so casting back to what their early lives were like and which state in the US they lived in, and the states that had the greatest equality of opportunity for people when they were in early life and going through adolescent and early life development. And off the top of my head, I can't remember. It was a state like Connecticut, I believe, that had greater equality. The people in those states in the 80s and 90s had better cognitive health and a lower risk of dementia than people who'd grown up where there was less equality of opportunity, which I believe, and I can't quite remember, I think it was Mississippi, and I'm not from the US, so I'm just kind of imaging a map in my mind where there was greater inequality for people now in their 80s and 90s. Yeah. So we've got biological sex.
Yeah.
But we've also got the experiences that you have by virtue of the biological sex you are. Gender is something different because we could use gender to describe the experiences that we have based on the biological sex we are. So we would talk about gender equality or gendered experiences. But then gender now is also used to describe the feeling that you have about your biological sex and whether the feelings that you have match with your biological sex. And when we can't image that because that's a belief or a thought process about your biological sex.
We're staying within the context of the biological definition of sex.
But your biology determines the life experiences you have, but it depends where in the world you are. So are you going to compare the brain of a woman who's 80 years old living in India with the brain of an 18-year-old living, like my son, living in Australia with every kind of advantage given to him just by virtue of the fact of where he was born? They're going to have vastly different life experiences. So the only thing it's not only biological sex that is driving that, it's an experience of a lifetime that's also driving those differences. So it's fascinating to think and talk about. And when some people say, yes, there are sex differences, and other people say, no, there are not. Some people say it's all Mother Nature. Some people say it's all patriarchy. It depends which measure you're looking at, which one you want to pick out and then study and then say what's driving that.
Of course. And that's very interesting because really, I mean, it totally makes sense. Our brains are the sum of our biology, of our experiences, of what we went through. All of those things take an effect, and that's something you talk about a lot.
Yeah, biology and biography.
Exactly.
And then also expectation, and then also, because we're humans, we've got, whether we call it mind or whether we call it thoughts or whether we call it expectations, we've got what's happening in our biology, we've got our life experience, but we're filtering that through and creating a narrative and an identity and making meaning of that. And that's also influencing then the outcomes and the experiences that we have. What we believe may happen will, what we tune our attention into can also alter, that experience that we have.
So let me ask you a question, and this is probably difficult to answer because it's like asking, was it the chicken or the egg? What is an introvert and what's an extrovert? Can you turn an introvert into an extrovert and vice versa? I can imagine vice versa is probably easier. But how much of it is, again, going back to the question, how much of it is biology? How much of it is how you were raised? How much of it stems from childhood? Experiences, how you were raised, perhaps what you experienced as a child. Do we know anything about that? Because as you said, the brain is, as far as neuroplasticity, has the biggest plasticity in I heard you say in a podcast during the first 5 years of your life. And so how much of that has to do with being introvert versus extrovert? Is it from the day you were born? Is it written in your genes, or is it something, or we don't know?
I don't know anything about the science of introversion and extroversion, so I can't answer that at all.
I was just curious.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know much about that. I mean, that's kind of more in terms of personality
Psychology,
science, and I'm not that familiar with that, so I wouldn't want to say. But any kind of behavior is going to emerge, like as I said, as a combination of your biology and your biography. It all stacks up. In terms of when our brain's most plastic, so if we think about brains developing from like loosely from the back to the front, and if we think about what's at the back of our brain in terms of our cortex is our visual system, and so we know that that's developed and patterned up and starts to see, and the experiences that we have as we see wire up the visual part of the brain, and that's almost the first part of our cortex to develop. And that's what I actually did my PhD research on, was development of visual cortex and what drives the development and the wiring up of patterns of connections in that part of the brain. And then if you move a little further forward in your brain, you've got like hearing and you've got language and you've got sensory input, you've got motor and movement. And then finally, the frontal parts of your brain are more involved with things like social cognition, executive function, emotional regulation, planning, judgment, reasoning. And we see this trajectory of brain development and the emergence of behaviors and skills across development from birth all the way through to late adolescence. So we see these kind of windows of plasticity sort of open and close off, more or less close off, depending. Vision will close off much earlier and much firmer than, say, your ability to regulate your emotions, which is, a bit fuzzier around the edges in terms of that window opening and closing. And by plasticity, that means that the experiences you have are often fundamentally required to guide the wiring up. So the experiences you have are going to determine what that brain kind of functions like later in life. Language is a great example of that. And we now know how, and I don't know whether it happens everywhere in the world, but certainly in Australia, babies are screened for hearing loss before they even leave the maternity ward in the hospital, because we know how fundamentally important it is for babies to hear spoken word to wire up the language centers of their brain. Because if they are born deaf and no one picks it up until they're 3, 4, or 5, the language centers of their brain have kind of reached the limits of experience-dependent plasticity, and is that much harder for those brain centers to be able to learn and change and grow. So we've got that kind of trajectory of plasticity. The changes that we see during adolescence are these kind of more frontal lobe functions. And that doesn't mean that those parts of the brain are not working, or the terms I hate when people talk about the teenage brain and adolescence are like it's undergoing renovation, or it's half developed, or it's not fully developed. And we're so dismissive and derisive towards teenagers learning those skills. We should be enabling them to learn these skills.
And we're nurturing.
We should be nurturing them. And we say, so when teenagers perhaps make decisions which might show lack of judgment or planning, we go, oh, well, it's because their brains are half developed. They will eventually develop by the age of 25. We would never speak to toddlers going, oh, well, they can't pronounce that word correctly. I suppose by the time they're 5, their brain will be developed and they can speak clearly. Or look at them falling over while they learn to walk. I suppose their brain's half developed. We wouldn't dream of that. We are so mean to teenagers. Well, what we should be doing is
maybe it's
ensuring...
because they're mean to us.
Well, they are, but there's a reason for that, right? Yeah. Because part of that's sort of what we need brains to do, and the owners of those brains going through adolescence is, you're meant to become an independent being separate from your family. You've nurtured, and as mothers and fathers, we nurture them in the family home, in the nest, and then there's social reorientation, which is necessary for them to kind of develop their own identity and make their way out into the world. And they need to be focused more on their friends than on their family. And their brains are fundamentally requiring that type of input from outside of the family nest, the family home, to guide and wire up those parts of the brain. And leaving the family nest requires bravery. It requires courage, especially when you first start stepping out. It's quite scary. And the flip side of that sometimes is almost too much courage, too much sensation seeking, and we might call that bravado. But teenage brains need to be sensation seeking because they need to be driven to try something new and different than what they've always done at home as kids. They need to be sensation seeking. And part of that involves a lot of the sensation seeking and perhaps risky behaviors and silly things that teenagers do. And no judgment to anyone out there who's a parent, because I've got teenage boys and I've seen some wild and crazy things go on as they are sensation seeking. And that's not because their brains are half developed and they are stupid until they're 25 or they don't know what they're doing. It's just the drive to seek sensation and and tribal approval while you were doing that.
I actually heard an evolutionary biologist talk to that topic, saying that even when you look at the animal kingdom, for example, lions, the young adolescent lions, that's why they even attack the pack leader or their own father so that they can move up the hierarchy. But the reason why they become or start turning on their own pack and hating it is just so that they can leave the pack and join a different tribe. And so they don't co-populate in their own tribe from a biological standpoint. And so in the way he was explaining it, in humans, that behavior is also embedded so that the teenager, just like you said, will obtain the courage to go out and make new connections and learn new stuff in order to develop the brain.
Yeah.
But it goes,
and they're probably moving towards new and interesting sensations and people and experiences, but there's perhaps also a bit of moving away from.
So you don't co-populate.
100%. And you've got
to more variety of genes.
Absolutely. And you've got to, and the brain requires those types of experiences. And that's all part of identity formation as well. And even if we look at like the stories that we tell ourselves about who we become as we are becoming young adults or as we're becoming parents or later in life, we've constantly got these narratives and these stories that we're telling as we create ourselves. And we can see the emergence of the meaning that we make about the stories we tell about ourselves through adolescence too. And that's the becoming of an adult. So we talk about adolescence. And I think we so often default to talking about dysfunction and talking about the things that they do wrong instead of understanding
humans
that their
love
brains
to be judgmental. We just love to be judgmental. That's just a societal issue that we have. We love judging things.
And they're at their peak of learning, and maybe they don't love Shakespeare. But that's okay. We're so, the studies that have been done looking at risk-taking, for example, and you can get, there's this really well-known study where they got teenagers into the research lab and they got them to play like kind of a driving game, like kind of a chicken game. And the more risks they took, the more points they got. And when they were driving by themselves, the teenagers took no more risks than when an adult did. It was only when they had their mates looking over their shoulder, kind of egging them on to take more risks. They took.
Peer pressure.
So they're well able to make judgments and take risks, but the sensation seeking and the tribe approval and the sense of belonging that comes from doing something a little bit edgy outweighs the sensible decision making.
If my boys are listening, just drive alone. Don't have your friends in the back seat.
I think, and I mean, I don't know what it's like in the US, but here we've got quite strict rules, and in New Zealand as well. when you go off your learner's license here, it's called being on your provisional or your Ps, and you have a P on your car.
Yes.
There's quite strict rules about how many other people you're allowed in the car after a certain time. You're only allowed one other person after 11 p.m. in the car with you, etc. And that's exactly because of that, because when they're by themselves, they don't typically make as silly decisions as when they're in a group.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question.
And that's all normal and natural and healthy, I think, but we tend to be so brutal, and we're fixated on this idea about 25. A lot of the brain development happens kind of during puberty. I just think we need to flip this.
Yeah, what is that? What is up with that? Because what is it? Because
it doesn't like get to 25 and then it's mature and you become this complete mature.
I know people my age, they behave like 12-year-olds. I behave like an 8-year-old sometimes. So I don't buy into all of that.
Yeah,
I totally agree with you.
No,
but why is it that they say the male brain, especially the frontal lobe, the part of the cognition, doesn't fully mature up until age, 27 or whatever that age is? And why is it different than the female brain?
Well, I haven't heard that it's any different from the male or female brain. It's just typically, and males have also got, the added bonus of, and testosterone's pretty wild in terms of development. I've got teenage boys in the house. I have this newfound respect for how it creates these bodies and these brains and these behaviors. So there is more risk-taking that we would perceive as risky in young males, and there has been and there is in every culture. But then females also engage in, like falling pregnant is perhaps one of the riskiest things that you can do as a female in terms of mortality and in terms of health. But we don't tend to think of the risks that girls and women take in the same way as we do with boys and men. So there's a bit of the social perception of what risk is. The age 25, there's lots of different theories out there. I think it's just one of these ideas which has kind of taken hold and become popularized, and we see a trajectory of development from, in utero life the whole way through, and we see different skills and behaviors and cognitions peaking and waxing and waning at different ages. There's some really cool new research which has just come out from a friend of mine here in Sydney University, Maureen Irish, who's a cognitive neuroscientist, who is looking at measures of behavioural and cognitive flexibility. So how flexible are you in your thinking and your behaving? How more or less set in your ways are you? And the most flexibility is around kind of your mid-40s to your mid-50s. So actually we peak in some things at this age, which is great news, right? Because typically we valorize and only talk about the kinds of cognitive skills that we're probably quickest and sharpest and fastest at in, like, say, late teens, early 20s. We seem to think that those are the skills that matter the most, perhaps in the workplace, that quick fire, memory, problem-solving thinking. But other types of skills that we get better at through life, wisdom, you've got a lifetime of experience that's guided you. Wouldn't you rather, if someone was doing surgery on you and your face, you'd probably want one of your contemporaries versus some young gun who's 22, right? Just because I've got a quick memory. Wouldn't you want someone experienced and wise with judgment?
Yeah, in our profession, we say when in our profession as a surgeon, we really reach our peak around age 50. So because you have a ton of experience and you're not old yet, you haven't fallen off the other side yet, where, maybe your eyesight or your, stamina or your hands are maybe shaking.
Your fine motor skills.
Your fine motor skills are there. So we all have a prime, which is mid-40s to mid-50s. That's our prime decade. And it's because of that, you have experience, perspective, and still you're on top of your game. But talk to me about, let's get into the 60s, 70s and further. Let's talk about brain fog. This is a topic that it's become a buzzword on social media, especially as it pertains to aging, whether hormones, especially in women with menopause, or even with men, or as a component of aging in general. It's affected most middle-aged to older population. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what causes brain fog? Because I heard you talk a lot about that. The common denominant when it comes to brain fog, really, to me, all things lead back to how much sleep we get and how much of a quality sleep we get, whether we're in menopause, whether we're getting quote unquote older, so forth. How much of it has to do with is it the chicken or the egg? Is it because we're not sleeping more or better when we get older, whether it's hormonal issues or other habits? Or is it like a biochemical thing, or is it just the aging of the brain? That's how the cookie crumbles.
Well, I think brain fog is probably one of those words, but like stress needs some
yeah. It doesn't get vaguer than that.
We need better words. German's
or
quite
context,
good for that. Yeah, we need. I suppose we've got brain fog and pregnancy and motherhood. We call baby brain, depending where you are in the world. People with ADHD have brain fog. You've gone through chemotherapy. You just missed a few nights' sleep. You've drunk too much. Whatever. It's one of these words which is. I mean, you would know, in medicine, it doesn't have a formal definition. It's a colloquial description of symptoms that someone would bring to a doctor and say, help me out. And it's most often like, but I am a 50-year-old female, so my entire algorithm is geared towards sending me information about menopause right now as if it is this looming catastrophe. And I'm not finding it particularly catastrophic, but, I'm perhaps doing a lot of things to avoid the catastrophe, least not the expectation and the mindset around the information, because social media is an active ingredient. The information we absorb is an active ingredient in our experience too. So, I think we need better words for brain fog. In terms of brain fog around in female menopause, which is, I suppose, where I'm most familiar with it, you use the term chicken and egg, and I think that's quite true. We don't know whether brain fog, feeling like you can't remember or not being able to find words, and for me particularly it's names of people, but then sometimes my husband can't remember names, and I've been with male people my age.
I'm
one of my
horrible
mates
at
the other day.
Names.
I used to be really quick. I'm just a bit slow. I was with a mate the other day and we were walking along a river and there was a sunken mattress in the river. And he said, oh, look at that mushroom. I mean mattress. And I knew he meant mattress when he said mushroom, but it kind of looked like the color of a mushroom. So I know why he said that. And I'm like, he's not menopausal. so it's not just.
Can't be.
So when
That was a good guess.
This is the thing, chicken and egg. Is it directly due to roller coastering hormones of menopause or the loss of hormones after menopause, or is it some knock-on impact that the changes in hormones are having, perhaps on our sleep, or perhaps on network reorganization? So we see as brains mature, go through midlife, instead of there being very specific defined brain networks activated while we complete tasks or try and remember a name or a word, we see more integration between networks. It's almost like the brain goes, hey guys, we need more neurons to get this job done, so let's teamwork. So as we're going from segregated networks to more integrated networks, is it that? Is it, and one thing that I think people forget when they're talking about brain fog across menopause is if we're now including perimenopause, and people are now saying, well, I'm getting perimenopause symptoms in my early 40s, we could be looking at 10 or 15 years of brain aging as well until we get to the other side of menopause. So we've got natural brain aging happening during that time. So we don't know whether it's directly due to hormones per se that is directly impacting the function of neurons, or if it's disrupted sleep, or if it's a combination or a kind of a complex web of lots of factors, which it's probably going to be a complex web of factors because everything to do with the brain always is. I will say some studies that have been done looking at trajectories of women going through, and we really need more longitudinal studies. We follow large groups of women through, so we see the various trajectories and the individual variation, because not all women are the same. And right now, because there's been neglect within this space in terms of education and research, we're only hearing the worst stories because we're trying to dial up the interest in this space. We can't just go, oh, many women are fine. That's not a very interesting story. we'd see women with different trajectories going through. So some women will go through the perimenopause and menopause and don't notice a thing. Some women might go through, and I'd probably put myself in this space, being 50 and let's say I'm still perimenopausal, with slight changes in verbal recall. And it's typically around words, because women are typically, if we looked at a large population of women and men might be slightly better at some aspects of mathematical reasoning or spatial rotation. Women on average might be slightly better at verbal recall or kind of word games, say. And some women might just see a slight dip during perimenopause in terms of remembering words or names or just blanking on words. And then they improve once they hit menopause. Other women, you might see more deficits that we could pick up in cognitive functioning. And typically those women often have lower levels of education and a whole lot of other, kind of like almost a perfect storm of perhaps terrible sleep, other types of health issues, perhaps out of control vasomotor symptoms, which can't be managed very well. So we'd typically see kind of a constellation of symptoms there. And do we see those women always improving? Not necessarily, but they might not necessarily keep declining either. So there's different trajectories of women and different experiences women are having going through perimenopause. I think because we've talked so much about brain fog right now, my concern is that, as I say, this is also an active ingredient in an experience. You'll go looking for it, and then you will notice it, and then you might make the experience feel worse than it otherwise might be. Added on top of that, right now, about the only tool that we have for perimenopause and menopause is just to add in some more hormones. We've got menopause hormone therapy, or still called HRT in many parts of the world. And all we can do is just keep adding in some more estrogen and progesterone and maybe testosterone if you want to. That's never going to mimic that brain ovarian conversation that we've had throughout our lives, which is like a feedback loop where there's this constant conversation that's very well regulated. All we can do is just kind of throw some estrogen in to the system and hope that that will help. And when it comes to cognition, we don't always necessarily see that helping. If it's helping someone treat vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, night sweats, and they're sleeping better, we might see an improvement. But not if perhaps they've got depression alongside that. So it's very complicated.
Yeah.
I think that give us another 10 years, we might have some more sophisticated ways of thinking about and understanding about what's going on here.
But I think
right now it's all very blunt tools.
Yeah, but I think you broke it down beautifully because it is a multifactorial thing. And I don't think anyone, it even would make sense to be able to narrow it down to one thing, because nothing is just one thing,
No,
your brain,
nothing is,
It was never one thing that developed your brain, so it can never be just one thing that affects your brain, and so it wouldn't even make sense.
Yeah, but I think they're not the stories that, the charismatic solutions of one thing sells a story, right? And that's not, and like you say, it's never one thing. People want it to be one thing.
Yes,
and right now, the one tool that we have when we're having this conversation about women in midlife, besides, of course, the boring advice about exercise well and eat well and sleep well and try not to get too stressed, is to use HRT. And it's a very blunt tool. And right now it doesn't seem to be, despite what you may hear otherwise, the only answer for cognitive health. And it's certainly not.
Yeah.
It's certainly not. The data, again, despite what many people may hear, is incredibly mixed in terms of how it's going to impact longer-term brain health, dementia risk.
Certainly.
It's very, very mixed data. It's not preventing dementia. It's not causing dementia. We've got studies saying both. And I often think about dementia risk or risk for any health and one of those like old-fashioned scales where you've got weights that you put on either side, and you've got risks on one side and protective factors on another. And sometimes you can't do anything about some of these factors.
Heck, even simple habits like alcohol consumption, that can affect it. You could have your hormones perfectly regulated. You could have perfect lifestyle habit as far as sleep, diet. You put alcohol in the mix, it just shifts the whole
Yeah,
balance
yeah,
of
yeah.
weight towards,
Yeah, and
especially when it comes to brain,
and maybe it
right?
depends how big the alcohol. I mean, you're drinking a bottle of wine every night, or are you going out
So,
and having a glass of wine with your friends
so,
once a week and
so,
having a laugh? So,
yeah,
you've got the social impact there. And I think
yes,
with HRT, in particular, menopause hormone therapy, right now, we don't know the size of the weight and which side to put it on. And there's a few little weights going on either side that's tipping the scales one way or another. And then we've got like our sort of our genetic risk underlying that. We've got our genetic makeup, and it may be that there's different trajectories of people depending on their genes. And maybe that's going to be altered by their early life experiences, including how much education they had in early life.
totally.
All of that's going to send different people off on different trajectories of aging.
They actually did a study on looking at, they did an epidemiology study on looking at the demographic status, education status, wealth status of different various population and their biologic age and their all-cause mortality.
Yeah.
And you could clearly see a huge difference, just populations from different socioeconomic status that have a complete higher all-cause mortality, different biologic age. And so all of these affect, and that proves the point that there's so many factors involved in how we even age. And to me, brain aging or health is part of aging. It's just like any other cell. If
100%.
If your skin ages, your heart ages, your lungs age, your brain will age too, and vice versa.
100%.
So it's
exactly.
so multifactorial. And so that's why I always chuckle when there is these influencers come and say, you have to do this, and if you do this, this will happen. And I'm like, really? If it was just that easy.
If it was that easy, it would be that easy.
I know,
and I always joke, I say, there's the gut brain people and the hormone brain people and the sleep brain people and the cold bath boys and the socioeconomic factors. And there's all of these different, all these different factors which are, and the brain's just like, well, I'm just in the middle here, guys. Taking on board all of this data from all of these different sources throughout a life.
And you know what, Sarah, the risk is?
I'm within an ecosystem.
And you know what the risk with that is, Sarah? And I see that trend. People get so confused. And when people get confused, guess what they do? They won't change and they won't do anything. So we're really scaring them of making changing those habits that you say that they need to do to move the needle. Yeah,
and wellness has become very pious. It's not much fun either. I think people feel like they've got to be these perfect bros who do absolutely every single thing to change the needle. And we know what's actually going to change the health of a population more than you're going to take your ice bath or not. Actually, well, you said socioeconomic status and poverty is the greatest predictor of longevity. Look at Queen Elizabeth. She perhaps is such a great example of someone whose health span and lifespan were both long and great, but she was born into massive socioeconomic privilege. She had access to kind of every privilege that anyone could possibly have. That as possibly ever had in terms of health and well-being, but she was socially connected. She was intellectually stimulated. She had
how old was she
4 kids
when she passed?
Oh, she was in her 90s. But, she was working up until a couple of days before she died.
Yeah, I remember.
Her life was and she probably didn't drink as much as her sister did.
You think?
Her sister drank and smoked all that time. But, I mean, there's also people who drink and smoke and, the oldest ever living woman, Jean Calment, French lady, smoked until she was age 117 or something.
Well, those are genetic exceptions.
There's the genetic exceptions. That's the thing. So
that's a genetic exception.
We can try our very best. I just think what is missing is a little bit of fun and joy along the way.
Well, human connection is so important when it comes.
People are being very pious and very boring, I think. It doesn't seem, I don't want to spend my whole life trying to optimize myself. I want to have a bit of a good time along the way.
I totally hear you. I went through all the phases. Now I've gotten to that point where I'm trying to find the balance because, you have to have fun living. That doesn't mean drink a glass of scotch every night or a whole bottle of wine every night. That's not what I mean.
There's other fun ways to have apart from alcohol.
But also, key is moderation.
Yeah, I
The
drink
key is
alcohol.
moderation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The key is
Yeah, I drink
moderation.
it. And I think for me, it's a social, it's great fun to go and have a drink with my mates. It's one of my favorite things to do. Go out with the
Amazing.
girls, have a laugh. And that's okay.
So
Like,
what do
I'm
you
not
do
going to
for
sit at
your
home and be
health and
pious.
what do you do for your health and wellness? Where are you right now in your life? How do you find your balance? Kind of walk us through your weekly routine. Do you
Oh
if you
gosh.
have one?
Well, coffee in the morning in bed, thanks to my lovely
Okay.
husband. So I've got
Man, he's
and I
getting a lot of
live.
credit, man.
He deserves it. He deserves it.
Yeah, wow. Goes a
Um,
long way. A cup of
I
coffee goes a long
I
way.
live in perhaps one of the I would say it's probably a blue zone, the northern beaches of Sydney, Australia. It's a very healthy, wealthy, has a very high well-being index.
And what makes
I
it
live.
that?
I think
What makes
everyone
it
is
that?
very wealthy, outdoorsy, very accessible. They can they can go and rank. They give well-being. You can rank each suburb
Wow.
based on well-being index. We're
Wow.
by the sea. We have a very fortunate world in which we live here. So it's very easy when everyone else around you is living a life like that to live in a way that's healthy.
Man, I might move there.
So yeah, it's great. I love it. I try. I mean, and I have stresses in my life. I have teenage sons, and I have aging parents, and all of those things. And I try my best to regulate my stress. Occasionally, perhaps when I shouldn't, with alcohol, but whatever. I quite like a jigsaw puzzle too as a way to calm myself down. I try and go to the gym or do exercise almost every day. So I lift weights 2 or 3 times a week. I do pump classes. I do Pilates. I do
Wow.
ocean swimming. My boys sail and surf, and I enable them to do that as much as possible. I've got a really cool set of hilarious friends the same age as me. I'm in a musical theatre group with some of them. I can't sing
That's
or
fun.
dance, but we just have fun. I have lots of very loyal friends from early childhood who I'm in touch with, if not every day, easily every week. And I eat pretty well, but every now and then I'll eat too much chocolate. I try to just follow all of the things, but try not to achieve perfection because that's boring. And I protect my sleep almost above and beyond anything else. So I'll have a couple of cups of coffee in the morning. I won't have any more the rest of the day. And I try to never do anything except when I'm teaching some of my courses. Sometimes I teach from 7 until 8:30. And I do not like that because then I can't get to sleep easily afterwards.
Sure.
So most of the time I'm in bed by 9, read my trashy books, and then I usually sleep pretty well.
Interesting. Any tips for any anti-aging tips for the brain that you can give us? Are you actively, based on your knowledge of neuroplasticity and brain, anything you actively do and make part of your habit to slow down the car that's driving towards the cliff when it comes to neurodegenerative disease and prevention thereof? Any tips you can give us, or would you just say, you know what? I don't know.
Besides being very
I'm not
thankful
too
for
focused.
living where I do here in Australia, and I'm very, like, my ecosystem is pretty great. I would say sleep, but I've always been a good sleeper, and so I try and protect and nurture my sleep. And I only just started wearing a Fitbit. I didn't want to get an Apple Watch because I didn't want to constantly have interactions.
I know, I got rid of mine. I
But
couldn't stand
I
it.
have a Fitbit now, and I have been paying more attention to, my resting heart rate and trying to, hit peak heart rate a few times a week. I've been trying to pay a little bit more attention to those metrics without like obsessing over it.
It's very easy to get into that obsession.
Yeah,
let me tell you.
but also because I'm not really, I think it's a bit boring to be obsessed over things like that. It's not that interesting, but I'd keep an eye on it. So that has perhaps encouraged me to be a bit more, but I've always been pretty good at going to the gym. Actually, I just got told by the gym the other day, I've done 225 pump classes in the last couple of years. That's lifting weights to music.
Good job.
So there's that. And then there's this sort of as I said, I've got this great ecosystem I live in, but the social side of things, I purposefully and actively try to engage and interact socially with other people. And what I wanted to do for turning 50 this year was, we're having a big party in a couple of weeks. Me and my husband, he's also turning 50. We invited like far too many people. It's going to be a rager. It's going to be awesome.
Wow.
But we also went around the world to have dinner with friends. So we wanted to just engage with people that we know and love, that have had in our lives for many
beautiful.
years. And so that's very, very,
Beautiful.
that's perhaps more important to me than almost anything.
There's a lot of research on that, on connections, on social connections and anti-aging and neurodegenerative disease.
And there's being actively socially engaged, which I think, there's being alone and there's loneliness. And we know loneliness is the perception. You can be surrounded by people but feel lonely. So there's that perception, which is not great for your mental health and your overall physical health and brain aging. And then I think when you get into late life, the social isolation, there's the loneliness of that and the stress and the knock-on effects on metabolic health, etc., that would have. But then having someone to help you get to the doctor, or, encourage you to eat good meals, or encourage you to exercise. We see that with older people become very set in their ways and don't have the support systems around them to enable the kind of healthy behaviours and things that they need. So those are those aspects. Right now, I'm not at that point, but I've got people in my life who are, that I need to lend a hand to.
Yeah, beautiful said. I just noticed. I would love to close it because this was such a beautiful thing to close it with, but I forgot to ask a very important question. I don't know whether or not it's something you can actually answer, because it's something that's very near and dear to me and I deal with on a daily basis. And I just wanted to pick your brain on it, no pun intended, on social behavior, especially when it comes to body image and body dysmorphia in teenagehood. And then I see another peak in middle ages with the transition of is there anything in your field, as far as brain development that has been researched or can be explained, or is this does it go more towards into the behavioral sciences?
I think it's more social, and I'm 50 and I'm constantly fighting this because I have not had Botox, which you can tell, and I'm not going to. But gosh, it's a hard daily battle internally, especially if you were Gen X and you grew up, because I suppose, like what you said earlier, you've got patients who don't look the way that they feel, and you look in the mirror and you see your face.
It's the first thing they tell me.
And you start to see your mother, and you're like, I don't want to look that way when I still feel young. And that's a really hard. And
it's almost like a cognitive dissonance.
It is. I did another podcast recently and I was like, oh my God, I look fat and jaundiced. And it's just like the lighting and the angle. It's really weird. I didn't even want to share it, but I was like, I had to. And I was like, oh, I look terrible. And then I'm trying to get into I'm not a model. I have a very good friend who's a model. I'm not a model. I'm a neuroscientist. People might just be interested in what you're having to say, not what you look like. But it's for me, it's a daily, not a battle, but there's this wonderful woman here in Australia who won. Her name is Gina Chick, and we have the same kind of literary agents, and she won Alone Australia here a couple of years ago, and she's just this goddess, this Amazonian woman who is so wise, and she said this phrase, which I repeat to myself all of the time, that we are of nature, and there are no mirrors in nature. The closest thing that we could see in nature as a mirror might be like you look into a pool of water, and even that's ripply and blurry, and we spend so much time on screens and looking at ourselves and reflecting back, and that's so unrealistic. And I'm determined and compare.
Especially with social media and younger in teenagers, they constantly compare each other. Yeah,
they're comparing. And it doesn't get any better when you get older, despite the positive aging influences which are out there, who are all like beautiful anyway. So like I would like a really non-classically beautiful midlife influencer to be out there talking. So I don't know about the neuroscience of that. All I can just say is my personal feelings about that. But I often then think about all of the women in my musical theatre group, and we, we're doing all of our, when we have our performances and we spend a lot of time in our underwear and we're changing, we've got our Spanx on, and we're all just laughing at each other and thinking we're all in our 40s and 50s, and when does the body image stuff fade away? And we're all going, oh, maybe it never will. The only way around it is to laugh about it.
That is such a great attitude. I love that.
And I also feel
liberating.
When I see my other friend, most of my friends who I grew up with, I'm still very close to around the world. None of them have done anything to their faces. We're not Botox users. We haven't had any work done. And I just feel such tenderness and warmth when I see their faces aging like mine, because I'm like, it just makes me feel very
home,
like
you know them.
We know them, and oh God, it makes me feel really weepy. It's really weird. It's like we've all aged together, and there's something really beautiful in that.
Yeah, it's a connection. I mean,
but there's a cognitive dissonance there when you do stuff on social media, and so you're constantly looking at your face. I hate that. Yeah.
It's because it has two parts to it. I could speak to it, but what you're saying is beautiful, because when you see at someone's face that is unaltered, you can see how they lived. And so when you said that, is because you lived with them, everything about their lives.
Yeah.
And these are memories that you guys cherish, which creates this bond, and you don't want that to be altered. It's almost like you don't want the part of your common history to be wiped out by wiping out the wrinkle. And I've never thought of it until you just said it, and it just became so clear to me. And I'm not surprised why you got a little watery, because it speaks to the emotional impact of it.
And we're all turning 50, so many of my friends, and because we're school friends, and it's like we're all in the same place now, and we've all got teenagers who are like leaving high school and going off to university, and we're all having to like recreate a new identity. You go through matrescence when you become a mother, and there's such an identity shift, and every time the world moves under your feet, you have to. And it might not for many years. It's just like motherhood reinforce. You're a mother, and you've got all of those years, those primary school and high school years, where your day-to-day life is reinforcing the story that you're telling yourself about who you are, and then it shifts again. And I think so. Perhaps that's what midlife is about: is just being wise enough to tell a new story about yourself. And if you've got other people alongside you who are looking the same as you, and my old friends look the same as me, lots of women in Sydney don't, perhaps lots of women in lots of parts of the world don't, and but they're not who I grew up with and are growing old with, so perhaps I should not think about it. And I just always think there's no mirrors in nature, there's just each other. So
I love that.
That's the reflection I should be looking at.
I love that. That's something that I really take very seriously. I take to heart. I try to give my patients. I trust me. I decline so many patients that come. They want to make so many changes that I don't necessarily agree with, even though I tell everyone to each their own. But I think one of the things I'm now trying to do is I give them perspective, and literally what you said is just such a healthy attitude that I see it so rarely now. Maybe because it's of my industry, the people that come to me, I don't know. But even when I look around in our society, especially here in the United States, and I know it's different in Europe, and I think Australia is probably more similar to Europe than it is to the US. I don't know, just from hearing you talk, and maybe I'm biased because, I don't know many New Zealanders or Australians, but it's definitely a much, 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 much healthier way of going by it than constantly trying to keep up with the Joneses and with your other.
But I wouldn't mind one of those facelifts that you're seeing on social media all the time. I always look at myself in the mirror.
Yeah, I mean,
oh well.
So there's nothing wrong with turning back the clock. I tell my patients, right? You want to turn back the clock a little bit, that's fine, but you don't want to alter the way you look,
No,
turning back the
no.
clock, meaning how it was maybe 15,
Yeah.
20 years ago. And that's a
But we
very healthy
can't,
attitude.
yeah, I don't know. It
Yeah.
feels very silly and shallow if it's all about looks, because really it should be about
Well,
what's
to me,
underneath that. And then
I think
haven't we been telling the girls, the teenagers that?
yeah, but you know what? To me, it is much deeper than that. To me, it's more about self-esteem and self-confidence. It's not any different than putting on lipstick. It's styling your hair, wearing a certain dress, or putting some jewelry on. It's not any different. We do that just so we feel better. And, maybe doing, lifting your brows or getting rid of some wrinkles. I don't personally see it any different. And even in my patients, I treat cleft lip and palate children that were born with facial deformities. The psychology in them is the same. They just want to look confident in their skin. They want to look confident. They want to blend into society. They don't want people to stare at them as soon as they see them. It all is about self-confidence and self-esteem. And I believe, having in this business for 20 years, I think the key for everyone is to find their happy place and not to worry about how others judge them, and also not judge others for what they do, because, who cares? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're happy and content, more power to you, and there's no right or wrong way. So this was such a mind-opening conversation, Sarah. I can't believe this was probably my longest podcast, actually.
Well, I'm very long-winded, so I'm not surprised.
But this was very mind-opening. Actually, pun intended. Your work to me brings so much clarity to the chaos people feel, especially about these terms that we discussed, like brain fog or brain development versus plasticity, especially when they're going through changes they don't really understand. So thank you for reminding us that our brains are built for growth and not just decline.
Not just dysfunction and decline.
Right. And so I really appreciate that. And please tell people how they can find you, look you up online, and tell us about your recent books that you just wrote and where people can get it, because I think there's such valuable insights if someone wants to dive more deeper into our conversation.
Yeah, well, my website is Dr. Sarah Mackay, MCKAY, or McKay, as you might say in the US. .com. And so I teach a lot of professional development courses in applied neuroscience and brain health. So I've still got a few of them this year if people want to join in them. And I've written, I say 3.5 books. So I've written 2 books on women's brain health, the Women's Brain book and Baby Brain, which is about pregnancy and motherhood. The Women's Brain book, I've just written a 2nd edition update. So there was the 2018 version and then the 2025 version, which just came out about a month ago.
Wonderful.
So much has happened in women's brain health. There's no longer a niche. And then I've also written Brain Health for Dummies. So for dummies, that yellow and black iconic brand that, you could have, you might have Excel spreadsheets for dummies or dog training for dummies.
I love those.
There's Brain Health for Dummies. And that was fun to write because the whole point is it's not pious and super serious. Sure. It's kind of fun and entertaining. And I got to use lots of dad jokes and, silly little turns of phrase in it. And so you can buy.
Should we give your husband some credit for that?
100%. He always gets all of the thanks. Him, the boys, and the dogs. The 2 women's health books you can listen on Audible globally, Spotify, anywhere where you buy audiobooks. There's different versions of those books available in different parts of the world, depending on publishing jurisdictions. If someone in the US wants to pick them up, be my guest. Brain Health for Dummies is available everywhere.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. And for everyone listening, if something in today's episode sparked an insight, shared with a friend or someone navigating the same stages of their lives. And if you want more of Sarah's wisdom, check out her books, like she mentioned, on her online academy. Remember, beauty starts in the brain. Until next time, take care of your mind, your body, and your story. Thank you, and good night, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.